Before we start, I want to make one thing very, very clear. I went to go see this movie for one reason and one reason only. Because it had Jason Momoa in it, and he is, I swear to God, one of the hottest men on the face of the entire fucking planet. I do love a big, muscular guy who loves to walk around shirtless. Sorry, I spaced out there for a minute. What were you talking about again? Oh, right, Aquaman. Oh, Jason Momoa, the things I would do to him. Focus, Jacob, focus! Hey everyone, my name is Jacob, but the trolls, they call me Snowflake. Remember, if you enjoy this podcast, make sure to like, rate, follow, subscribe, whatever you can do, wherever you are listening to this. Make sure to follow me on Twitter to enjoy my asinine ramblings, follow the show's Twitter to avoid all of that, share my work across social media to help the show reach a larger audience, and if you are so inclined and have the means to do so, please consider throwing a couple coins into the beaten-up guitar case that I've laid onto the sidewalk that we in our modern age call the show's Patreon. I have no job outside of this podcast, so every single dollar really does make a world of difference in my life and allows me to keep on making this podcast for all of you. Plus, you'll get some great benefits, and you will be spared when the communist revolution finally overthrows our fascist overlords. Now, let's get entitled, shall we? I'm back! You all thought I was dead, but I'm back! I'm 1 year older now, sure as hell not a year wiser, with a whole lot less fucks to give. I'm trying out some new things for the show, trying to make it better for everyone involved, so hopefully you guys think it's a big improvement. I'm sorry, I'm largely making this up as I go. But enough about that. Let's cut to the chase for once and get to the very first video of the new year. The topic of this video is, of course, the new Aquaman movie of the DCEU. Now, I had very few expectations going into Aquaman. I didn't know what I was going to get. I knew that the movie was getting reasonably positive reviews, but I hadn't seen any of the DCEU, not even Wonder Woman. So I was hoping for the best, but preparing myself for a mediocre film that may have been a fun, entertaining movie, but ultimately was hollow and not really looking to say anything. But oh, how very, very wrong I was. Because the singular feeling I felt walking out of the theater after seeing this movie was refreshed. That's really the best word I can think to describe it. I walked out of that theater feeling like I had just taken a swim in a crystal clear ocean and was being dried off by the sun, renewed, energized, and more invigorated than I had been when I had gone into the theater. It was a big surprise to me just how much I loved this movie and just how much the movie actually had managed to say, which I had never really seen articulated very much in a major superhero movie before. Suffice to say, I knew I was going to have to do an episode on this movie, especially because it seems that so many people are sleeping on this one, which seriously, you all should not be. Go out and see this movie, trust me. Go for Jason Momoa's big tattooed pecs, but stay for the perhaps most feminist superhero movie yet. Now, of course, spoiler warning for Aquaman. I'll try not to spoil everything because I love this movie so much and I want people to go see it for themselves. But I really do want to talk about sort of the themes that are brought up in the film. So just a heads up, I cannot recommend this movie enough. So if you're on the fence and you don't want any spoilers, go see it. Seriously, it's worth it. I am giving you permission. Do watch it. Trust me. Now, I know I just said that I went into this movie with no expectations, but maybe that's not entirely true. Maybe it is. Basically, the one thing I wanted to see with this movie was if it was better than the DC animated movie Justice League Throne of Atlantis. A movie which I had seen several times as a formerly big fan of the DC animated movies. The main reason for this interest is because everything I had seen and heard about the movie made me a little worried that they were going to be rehashing the same basic plot as Throne of Atlantis. Like, I don't know, maybe this is just my take on things, but it really seems to me that DC has this habit of repeating stories over and over and over again, and I was really worried that they were going to do that with Aquaman. But I am very happy to report that while the basic conflict of the film is kind of the same, Aquaman definitely does this much better and in a much more fleshed out manner than Throne of Atlantis did. Most definitely. Honestly, I'm surprised that there hasn't been more comparisons made to Black Panther around this film, because I get the sense that this movie took a lot of notes from Black Panther, not necessarily in terms of plot, but more in the way the film is shot. If you've been complaining that all the DC films have been almost shot in black and white, then Aquaman is definitely the movie for you because the colors in this movie are saturated to the point where they're like almost gaudy. It is a film that was shot in Technicolor and lit with neon. The colors just, burst right out of the screen at you, but in a good way. I think that the color was one of the reasons why I found the film so fun and refreshing. The brightness and boldness of the colors just energize you like they energize the film. Especially Mira's hair. Like, her hair is bright red and really pops, especially in the other water scenes with all the green backgrounds. And I can see people maybe feeling like it looked fake, but nah, I don't really give a shit about that sort of stuff. I think the bright, gaudy colors kind of worked for the film and its flavor because the film has this feeling and theming to it, which I wasn't expecting. Kind of almost like a fairy tale feel to it. And that's something which is complemented by the bright colors. And really, I guess the fairy tale theming shouldn't come as a complete surprise. I mean, Aquaman's, given name is Arthur, and he is trying to become king. King Arthur. Moreover, the main bulk of the film is taken up by a big quest to try and find this trident that will help make Arthur king. I'll come back to the Trident MacGuffin in a bit, but I was very surprised because, interestingly, no superhero film I can immediately think of has gone for a more fairy tale theming to it. It is something which really could have gone very wrong. Whimsical stories seem to be something which modern theater audiences seem particularly skeptical towards and seem still unwilling to extend disbelief for in this day and age. But honestly, I love me some whimsical shit. Seriously, I am basically a manic pixie dream girl, but in dude form, so I love happy, whimsical media, and I can never get enough of it. Strangely though, considering how popular the manic pixie dream girl archetype has become in recent years, I am still not getting fucking laid. Come on guys, stop harassing the girls with pink hair and sparkly nails, and come become the personal fuck toys of a guy with long hair and sparkly nails. I'll happily show you ways to think about the universe that you never even thought existed. But anyway, the way the film is scored is also very similar to Black Panther, not necessarily in terms of the same musical style. Black Panther's music is more kind of hip-hop, whereas Aquaman's is more melodic with more instruments like horns mixed in, but they're similar in terms of how there's a very strong beat and funk that runs through all of the movie, which also helps to energize the movie. Keep kind of the epic atmospheres of the movies and also helps carry the moments of awe. And there were definitely some moments of awe in Aquaman. Maybe not as many as in Black Panther, but there were definitely some moments in the film where I was just like, oh, wow, that is so beautiful. I was just kind of struck by it. And I'm a sucker for an effective soundtrack. You give me a well-made soundtrack and it can almost carry a movie for me. And the added horns and more classical feel of the soundtrack also really kind of help the fairy tale aesthetic, while the funk and the added touches of synth and electronic really kind of helped it feel modern. And I really love that combination. I love when you kind of blend classic and modern together. And of course, not only is Jason Momoa probably an absolute sex god, but he's also actually a really good actor too. However, I have a feeling that he probably didn't need to act much for this. I get the sense that this is kind of just how Jason Momoa is. Like, it felt like a very natural performance to me, and Arthur really could have come off wrong, either being too brutal and dark like Superman or Batman, or too hammy, but they really seem to blend the seriousness and the hamminess together in a way that I really liked. Arthur is maybe a little bit tricky to relate to in the beginning, but I also feel like that's kind of the point. He comes off as kind of this big bear, just kind of barreling through into a fight and laughing the entire time he does it, kind of hamming it up a bit. But the film strips that away and you discover that he's actually very guarded and kind of keeps the world at arm's reach. And then that too is stripped away to reveal a guy who just has a big, massive heart, and I just completely love that. I think that that benefits the Justice League as a whole, because you have a lot of very serious people in the Justice League, like Wonder Woman and Batman and Superman, and then you have the sarcastic, wisecracking Flash, but you need a guy who is kind of hammy, who's gung-ho, and who is just upbeat like Arthur is. And again, from what I've seen of Jason Momoa, and maybe I've seen quite a bit of him, it does seem to be that that's just who Jason is. I'm sure he had an absolute blast playing Arthur, though that's at least the impression I get anyway. And really, if I can get off in a little bit of a indulgent tangent here, maybe that's why I find Jason Momoa so attractive, because if any one of you has ever wondered what my type is, I just love big, burly guys like Jason, who maybe have a bit of an edge, maybe are a little bit intimidating, maybe a little bit rough around the edges, but once you get to know them, they're just really big, giant teddy bears. A big, rough teddy bear is basically the kind of guy that just kind of gets me weak in the knees. A cinnamon roll dipped in dark chocolate, if you know what I'm saying. Plus, edgy, rougher guys are more likely to know what a collar feels like around their neck and to be able to take a little punishment. Wink, wink. Oh, what I wouldn't do to be able to collar Jason Momoa. Fuck, I'm hungry now too after that cinnamon roll bit. Anyway, I also really love the lore they built for the Atlanteans too, about how the Atlanteans kind of fragmented into 6 or 7 different kingdoms after Atlantis fell into the ocean. There's Atlantis and Zabel, whose citizens are, basically human, underwater humans. There's the Fisherman Kingdom, who are like this nation of scientists and philosophers and artists who look a lot like mermaids, fish people basically. There's the Brine Kingdom, which are more crustacean in appearance and aesthetic, and come off almost like dwarves from Lord of the Rings or Thor, which is maybe actually another inspiration for Aquaman too. There's the Deserter Kingdom, who moved to what at the time was an inland sea, but is now the Sahara Desert, so they were wiped out. And then there's the Trench, where the Atlanteans have devolved into these anglerfish monsters that eat anything they can get their hands on. I really loved this whole lore, and I love them all. I totally want a comic series or an animated series or something where you have one member of each kingdom working together, fighting underwater crime, protecting the ocean, stuff like that. That'd be great. I'd watch the shit out of that. And I love how the architecture of each kingdom is different. It's been adapted to the conditions and the culture of that particular area and the particular needs of that civilization. Even generic Atlantean tech has this style to it that I think is unique and interesting. This film focuses on the aesthetic and the feel of the civilization it's attempting to portray in a very similar way that Black Panther did, working to try and make it seem real and believable, and try to make it seem as real and believable as possible. I think that Black Panther still has a bit of an edge over Aquaman in that regard, but I appreciate the thought and the design that obviously went into so much of the world building. As I've said on the channel before, I am a sucker for good world building. And I know I've compared this movie to Black Panther a lot already, but it's honestly the best touchstone I can use to describe this movie to people who haven't yet seen it. And because I really do think that Aquaman really did take a hell of a lot of notes from Black Panther, and I think largely it's to its own benefit. And it also took notes about the theme of Black Panther too, because there is something actually of a racial subtext in this film. It's never stated outright, but it's pretty clear when you give it half a second's thought. I mean, Arthur is very clearly some kind of biracial or bi-species, I guess, being half Atlantean and half human, but of course being played by Jason Momoa, who is very clearly not entirely white. And it's a very interesting choice that every single humanoid Atlantean is portrayed by a white person, and that Arthur frequently is referred to as mongrel and half-breed and other terms which have been leveled at biracial people even up to the modern day. Isn't necessarily a full subtext? I don't know. I don't think I'm someone who can really say that. I don't know if the film really actually does anything with that subtext, if it is there, but I think it's an interesting little addition to the film, if nothing else. If there's one criticism I do have of the film, and it's definitely not a deal breaker or anything, but it's that Black Manta's inclusion in the film starts to feel a little bit clunky the longer it goes on, and it overall kind of feels a bit out of pace with the rest of the film. I think the introduction is definitely strong, and it really sets up Arthur's arc for the film, but the rest of the moment he's in just feel kind of tagged on and jammed in. It feels like they could have streamlined him a little bit, but maybe that's because I always felt that Black Manta's backstory was kind of needlessly complicated anyway. I definitely preferred how Black Manta was done in Throne of Atlantis, where he's basically just the right-hand man of Orm, Arthur's half-brother and the current king of Atlantis. Black Manta is basically Orm's private weapons dealer, and yeah, that works much better because we don't need this big introduction to a character who is only really going to be important in the next movie. But this does also introduce what I feel is one of the strongest aspects of the film, so I give it a pass overall. It's definitely not a deal breaker, as I've said. Oh, and the film does use a few jump scares, which, by the last one, I literally said in my seat, stop it, because it was raising my blood pressure so much, and because they happen at almost regular intervals. Also, the trenchers are fucking terrifying at certain moments. But as much as I've gushed about this film already, none of those are really the reasons why this film really resonated with me. I mean, they're all great things to have in a film. I'm sure I've loved films for having even half of what this film had. But the aspects of the film that really made it feel so refreshing for me were the times when the film worked to subvert the tropes it was using and the genre it was in. First of all, I'm really happy to see that the film really didn't need to just murder loads of people right in front of us constantly to get its point across. Yes, we do see the destruction after a tsunami hits the village where Arthur and his dad live, and we do get a big battle scene at the end of the film, and Orm does kill the Fisherman King right in front of his wife and daughter, but literally that's about it. The film knows that it doesn't need to do any more than that. This definitely stands in contrast, to Justice League, where, you have Steppenwolf ripping people in half and smashing people's heads in. And there's this one moment that really hit home and really kind of made me realize that, where there's this Vizier character in the movie, Velko, who is Orm's right-hand man, and advisor, but also is helping Mira and Arthur on their quest, because he's actually secretly loyal to Arthur's mother, Atlanta. And at one point later in the movie, Orm turns to Vulko and says that he knows that Vulko has been helping Arthur and Mira, and I immediately thought at that moment, oh no, Vulko's a goner, he's done for, Orm is gonna fucking run him through with that fucking trident, just like he did the Fisherman King. But then it just doesn't happen. Vulko admits it, and Orm has him taken away. And while some may think that this is a weak moment, I really didn't mind it. I'm not a fan overall of character deaths in film. I think they've been greatly overused in modern media as a whole, but I'm also so used to films not following how I would have done things that I was honestly shocked that finally a film had a chance to kill a named character, but didn't. It's a bold move in this day and age, if nothing else. And really, looking back on it, I think the purpose of that interaction is to show that Orm isn't a complete monster. He still sees Vulko as an old friend despite his betrayal, and Orm is still loyal. He's willing to murder to get what he wants, don't get me wrong, but he still has a sense of honor and loyalty, and he's not doing any of this because he enjoys killing. He's doing it because he truly believes that this is what he has to do, because he believes that it's either Atlantis or the surface world. And he's just so tied up in his father's ultra-nationalistic beliefs and Atlantean supremacy, but he's not a complete monster, that there is something still redeemable in him. Then there's also the fact that superhero movies as a whole are a spin-off of the action movie genre, and it's basically a cultural cliche at this point to say that action movies are almost always centered on singular male characters, and that they fight their way through mostly men and often men of color who stand in their way, often to save and or avenge the sexy lamp, which these movies call the female loved one. Action movies are, by this point, so notoriously misogynistic and Djangoistic that it's almost to the point of parody, but those tropes are still often there. But even though he's the one who the movie is named after, and ultimately it is his story, this really doesn't feel like it's just Arthur's story, because Mira accompanies him throughout pretty much the entire movie and saves his ass pretty much the entire way. Arthur never would have survived the first 30 minutes if not for Mira. I mean, the action revolves around Arthur, but it's not because he's inherently stronger or any more skilled than anyone else in the movie. In fact, Mira is probably his equal, if not a better fighter than him throughout pretty much the entire movie. The only reason why he is the center of the action is because of who his mother was and the fact that he has a claim to the throne of Atlantis, whereas no one else does. And Arthur very quickly realizes that he needs Mira if he's actually going to survive, because first of all, she's kick-ass, and because she knows way more about Atlantis and the relic that they're after than he does. But that's also not to say that Arthur is just a bumbling male protagonist who has to have the woman save him from his own bumbling nature. Arthur proves that he's important to this dynamic too, when they go up to the surface and suddenly it's Mira who is out of her element and needs to let Arthur take the lead so she can learn from him. And Arthur proves that he actually does have a brain in his head. He's just not all brawn and no brain. And all of this honestly leads to one of the funniest moments in the film, and it really highlights that the center of this film isn't Arthur or Mira, it's Arthur and Mira. Mira isn't his sidekick while he does all the work, but she also doesn't steal the spotlight from him. They're partners. Partners who, though they do initially butt heads, come to understand one another and come to find out that they actually work really, really well together. And so when romance does blossom between the two of them, it feels like it's earned, like it's grown organically between them, and not just, I am man, you are woman, we must smash our genitals together now as the laws of cinema demand. It feels like both of them are being attracted to each other, not just the man deciding he likes the woman and the woman just being assumed to like the man because he likes her. It feels like two characters who have grown and changed for the better because of the positive influence that the others had on them, and found out, they actually really do like each other in the end. And Mira does actually grow too. It's not just Arthur. Mira's world really does open up during her adventures with Arthur, and she comes to see that the surface world deserves protecting just as much as Atlantis does. Because in the beginning, she really does look down on the surface world as a whole, just like a lot of the Atlanteans. And hers is kind of the reverse of Arthur's and ours, where, we're discovering the beauty of Atlantis, and that this is a beautiful place that deserves to be protected and saved from Orm and the war that he's planning. Whereas Mira's journey is her realizing that there is beauty in the surface world too, that this is a beautiful place just like Atlantis, and it deserves to be protected just as much. And even though I criticized it a bit I really do appreciate how Arthur responds to Black Manta, because I am so tired of the whole superheroes not killing anyone is just unrealistic, man argument that I basically made a 45-minute episode about it that you should totally go watch after this one. And I'm always happy when a piece of superhero media actually says, no, there's actually a good reason why we don't kill, and here it is. It's basically the very first scene in the movie is Arthur foiling Black Manta's attempt to steal a Russian submarine. During the altercation, Black Manta's father gets pinned under a torpedo, and the submarine begins to sink. Black Manta asks Arthur to help, and Arthur's like, you tried to murder innocent people, ask for mercy from the sea, and leaves, ultimately resulting in the death of Manta's father and Manta swearing his revenge on Arthur. Manta, of course, later attacks Arthur and Mira, and once they defeat him, Arthur admits to Mira, you know what, I really should have actually helped him, because now I've made an enemy that I didn't have to. And personally, I think that actually sounds like a pretty good and pretty intelligent reason for superheroes not to kill. And another really interesting aspect of the film that I've come to understand more and more as I've thought on the movie is the subversion of the quest narrative, which is kind of the backbone of the film. The main engine of the film is the mission that Arthur and Mira are on to find this ancient trident belonging to the first king of Atlantis, King Atlan. This trident is supposed to give whoever wields it control over the seven seas, but it's not the extreme power that they're after, it's the mythical nature of it. Legend states that King Atlan disappeared after Atlantis sank into the ocean and fragmented, taking the trident with him, and that Atlanteans have been looking for it ever since, not just because it's powerful, but because of its cultural and historical importance. The plan is that if Arthur can get a hold of this trident, then it will lend his claim to the throne some legitimacy and show that he is on the Atlantean side and make the elitist Atlanteans more likely to give him a chance. Most quest narratives focus on this object being so powerful that it will guarantee victory, or because by claiming it they receive power and wealth in return. Think of King Arthur and the Sword and the Stone as the ur-text of this sort of thing. But despite the trident being acknowledged to be very powerful, it's not sought after for its hard power, the power it has over the seven seas and all the energy it contains, but its soft power, its historical and cultural significance, and it doesn't immediately make Arthur king or anything, like the Sword and the Stone did for King Arthur. But it makes the claim that he already has to the throne more legitimate. It helps him win in the court of public opinion. The quest for the trident is Arthur working to prove that he is worthy for the throne despite everything that goes against him, but it's worthy in a much different way than we've seen in most of these narratives before. But oh, privileged and entitled snowflake, as you've been screaming for probably about the last, 20 minutes or so, what about the mouthfeel? I mean, what does any of this have to do with being feminist? You know, the question you posed in the title of the fucking episode? Well, the fact that this film features its two female characters so centrally to the plot definitely does help, but it's not just the fact that Mira is basically on par with Arthur in both fighting ability and power, and also in importance to the narrative as a whole, but also because so much of the conflict around the film deals with what happened with Arthur's mother and the decisions she had to make to both find a happy life away from what the movie implies is an abusive and controlling husband, but also what she has to eventually do to keep her new family safe. And especially considering that both Mira and Atlanta have been side characters and maybe a love interest at best throughout much of the comics, as well as the centrality of masculinity within the DCEU as a whole, that's something very, very refreshing to see. It was another way that Aquaman is leagues better than Throne of Atlantis, because Mira is basically just a secondary character and Atlanta is fridged before Arthur can ever really meet her. Though it also probably depends on how you classify something as feminist. I'm not entirely sure if Aquaman passes the Bechdel test. Maybe it just barely squeaks by, but I'm not sure. Also, I think it's very interesting that the quindent that Arthur had been using throughout Justice League, and which he used in the beginning of this movie, belonged actually to his mother, that he was using his mother's weapon. But the one singular moment that really made me realize that this was a feminist film was this one moment in the same conversation where Arthur talks about Black Manta with Mira. It's in this conversation that Arthur says, "I'm a blunt object. I've solved all the problems in my life by punching them, but the problems I'm facing right now and the problems that I'll be facing as king are things that I can't solve by punching them, and that's honestly kind of terrifying." Of course, this is true. There's a lot more to being a king and a leader in general than fighting battles, especially nowadays. And it does show that Arthur is smart enough to know what he's getting in for if he does become king, and self-reflective enough to wonder if he's up for the task. But I think that this also echoes the anxieties that a lot of men in our society face too. Feminist theory does say that men in our society are so often told that the way to solve all of life's problems is through violence or through aggression, that talking and that feelings are weak, are feminine, and that true men only express themselves in manly ways and aren't allowed to show emotion or mercy or love or compassion or empathy, and that this isn't the fault of men or anything, this is just the way society tells them they need to behave. But feminist theory teaches us that this way of acting out one's masculinity is also fundamentally inadequate, and often winds up hurting men just as much as it often winds up hurting the women in their lives. While this film certainly does not come down on Arthur for being so gung-ho to get into fight, in fact, it's his willingness to throw himself into a fight that saves the men on the submarine Black Manta was trying to steal. But this film also shows how this readiness to fight and his aggression also gets him into trouble. When he's captured by Orm early in the film, Orm goads him into a fight between the two of them for the throne, and Arthur takes the bait hook, line, and sinker, and of course, loses, because Orm is not just more skilled in underwater combat, he's also been planning this out while Arthur just jumped right into it. This is one of the times where Mira saves Arthur, revealing herself as a traitor to Orm, and then she tears a strip off him after, saying, "We had a plan. The plan was to get the trident and then fight Orm, but you let him sucker you into a fight, and now have forced me to reveal that I'm on your side, and made our mission even harder." It's the same sort of thing that Arthur says when he reflects on Black Manta. He made his life harder by getting into a fight with Orm, by thinking he could take Orm on. And of course, we see this mirrored as well in his interaction with Black Manta. Also because Black Manta is very similar to Arthur in his aggression and readiness to fight. Because of course, now that Arthur is responsible for his father's death in his eyes, he now has to go after Arthur for revenge, creating this endless cycle of violence and retaliation, which, let's be frank, still underpins masculinity to this day. The way Arthur had done things before failed him, just as it fails a lot of men in our society. But Arthur also shows that he has the ability to grow and change for the better. When he finally finds the trident, he has to face this giant mythical monster of Atlantean legend called the Carathin, which is guarding the trident. Again, it's a pretty typical scenario for this sort of story, but what's amazing is how Arthur fights the Carathin. So how does he defeat the Carathin? Well, he doesn't. He doesn't defeat it at all. In fact, he doesn't even throw a punch against it. He talks to it. Yeah, of course, being Aquaman, he can talk to sea creatures, but he talks to this monster. He tells it that he doesn't want to hurt it, that he only wants to get the trident so that he can protect the world and those he loves. And guess what? It works. The monster is taken aback and states that no one has tried to talk to it since King Atlan, who left it to guard the trident. Not a very manly way to solve a problem, is it? Talking things out, but it works more often than you'd think. The Carathin, when Arthur first arrives and it's kicking his ass, says how it's seen so many come try to claim the trident, but none have been worthy, and that it thinks that a half-breed Mongol like him is probably the least worthy of all. But when Arthur talks to it and then takes hold of the trident, guess what happens? Well, it's his movie, you can probably guess what happens. He proves he's worthy of the trident. So maybe the better question is, why is he worthy of it? What is it that makes Arthur worthy of the trident whereas so many others weren't? Well, I'd pose that it was the fact that Arthur actually talked and listened to the Carathin, just as King Atlan did. And what's also so significant is the fact that that's something that Arthur at the beginning of the movie wouldn't have done. Arthur, before he made the journey to find the trident, wouldn't have been worthy to hold it. He wasn't born worthy. Arthur became worthy. And because he talked to it, it then comes to aid him in the big final fight and put a stop to the fight between Orm and the Brine Kingdom. And so what was it that caused this change in Arthur that made him so worthy? Partially it was Arthur realizing that the usual way he did things wasn't always the best way. But I'd also say that it was Mira and his mom, the women in his life, encouraging him to do better than he had been doing and calling him out when he bullheadedly screwed things up. But that's also not to say that the more masculine way of solving things isn't also valuable. The big fight scene of the movie is the final fight between Arthur and Orm, but Arthur wins by using a defensive technique taught to him by Vulko. Playing defense? That doesn't sound very manly either. Men must always attack. And what does Arthur do when Orm shouts at Arthur to kill him? Arthur shows him mercy, as he's learned he should, because he knows that committing violence will only continue the cycle, and that the only way to break the cycle is to stop perpetuating it. So in the end, is this a feminist film? I don't know. What do you people want from me? I'm an aging twink with a useless bachelor's degree. Go ask an actual feminist scholar and see what they have to say. Personally, I would say that it is. But I don't think that the film is overtly feminist by any means. I don't think that it telegraphs this message enough for me to say that it is clearly a feminist film. But I think that this is a film which really does wind up telling a feminist message. I don't think that this film set out to be a feminist film. I think that the film set out to try and be a good film, first and foremost, and to use cliches and tropes when it suited that goal, but also challenge those tropes when they would have gotten in the way. Making the film more like a typical action movie would have seen Mira pushed to the side, and we would have missed out on a lot of the film's heart. Making Arthur just punch his way through everything would have robbed him of the growth and reflection that makes him a likable, sympathetic, and ultimately very endearing character. But the quintessential fairy tale aspects to the story also help differentiate it from other superhero films out there and make it a unique and stimulating experience. Just like how Arthur questioned his own behavior and the way he had previously tried to solve his problems, the film was smart enough to question and challenge the tropes it was faced with, and I always appreciate that in a story. But it also led the film in a surprisingly feminist direction. And in the end, that's what feminism is about. Questioning things, questioning the assumptions around gender that we are fed by society, and being self-reflective enough to grow into a well-rounded, actualized person. Because as much as a lot of people nowadays don't believe it, feminism is about helping men just as much as it is helping women. It's about teaching men that the idea of manly behavior that they've been taught often hurts them and leaves them unprepared for many of the problems they're going to face. That it's by learning from women and from each other and learning how to be sensitive, empathetic, willing to learn and listen, and to try and solve problems without violence, that they are truly able to take on any problem that they are presented with. It's not about turning them into a woman or making them give up what they've been taught. It's about being a whole, complete, and dynamic person. And that, in the end, also makes you a happier person and allows you to have a better relationship with your loved ones. I don't think Mira would have fallen in love with Arthur as he was before. I think it's only because he changed positively and because the two of them were able to develop an actual equal relationship that they were able to love one another. Maybe it's not a fully feminist narrative. Maybe I'm reading into things a bit to a feminist superhero, but I think that this is probably the closest to a feminist superhero movie that we're going to be getting, at least with a male lead anyway. And while I think Black Panther still has it beat, Aquaman is still a movie that I enjoyed immensely, and is now my second favorite superhero movie of all time. It was a refreshing dip in the ocean, wrapped up in Jason Momoa's big, muscly, tattooed arms, pressed up against his giant pecs, so you kind of slip into that place where the two pecs smush together, and you just know that he's never going to let you go. You can just feel every muscle of his body wrapping around you, and you just want nothing more than to reach around his big waist and fondle those two great big meaty mounds of flesh that he calls his big bubble. Whoa, sorry, I spaced out there for a minute. What were you talking about again? Oh, right, Aquaman. Yeah, I'm definitely going to be buying the Blu-ray of this one, most definitely, for reasons. Anyway, I think I've annoyed all of you for long enough. Again, make sure to like, rate, subscribe, comment, follow, whatever you can do. Share my work with your friends if you like it. Patreon meet audience, audience meet Patreon. All the important links will be in the description for the show, if there is a description where you're listening to this. Next video will be up by the end of the month, as we are now back to our usual podcast schedule. So, until next time, may the privilege be with you. Stay entitled, snowflakes.